Good morning, folks. I was kind of surprised to find that people actually did seem to enjoy the recording of the first chapter of Heir to the Empire. I wasn't sure if there was going to be an audience for that, and I know that viewership of these videos is kind of low on my own site, but it was interesting that the feedback that I got was that at least some of the people that were watching the video have never actually read the books, and so were interested to be introduced to this series. I think there may be some difficulties in trying to read the entire novel, at least in any kind of a timely manner. This is kind of time intensive to do. And one thing that I learned yesterday is that you kind of need to wet your whistle a little bit while you're actually reading because your mouth gets a little dry. So I don't know if I'll be able to read the entire book or do series or anything like that, but I did kind of enjoy doing it. So I guess I'll jump straight into doing chapter two. Let me know if you guys still like this. If you'd like to see more of this, um, we'll just jump in from there. So moving on, chapter two. Luke. The voice came softly but insistently, pausing amid the familiar landscape of Tatooine. Familiar, yet oddly distorted. Luke Skywalker turned to look. An equally familiar figure stood there watching him. "Hello, Ben," Luke said, his voice sounding sluggish in his ears. "Been a long time." "It has indeed," Obi-Wan Kenobi said gravely, "and I'm afraid that it will be longer still until the next time. I've come to say goodbye, Luke." The landscape seemed to tremble, and abruptly a small part of Luke's mind remembered that he was asleep in his suite in the Imperial Palace, and dreaming of Ben Kenobi. "No, I'm not a dream," Ben assured him, answering Luke's unspoken thought. "But the distances separating us have become too great for me to appear to you in any other way. Now, even this last path is being closed to me." "No," Luke heard himself say. "You can't leave us, Ben. We need you." Ben's eyebrows lifted slightly, and a hint of his old smile touched his lips. "You don't need me, Luke. You are a Jedi, strong in the Force." The smile faded, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus on something that Luke couldn't see. "At any rate," he added quietly, "the decision is not mine to make. I've lingered too long already and can no longer postpone my journey from this life to what lies beyond." A memory stirred. Yoda on his deathbed, and Luke pleading with him not to die. "Strong am I in the Force," the Jedi Master had told him softly, "but not that strong." "It is the pattern of all life to move on," Ben reminded him. "You too will face this same journey one day." Again his attention drifted away, then returned. "You are strong in the Force, Luke, and with perseverance and discipline you will grow stronger still." His gaze hardened. "But you must never relax your guard. The Emperor is gone, but the dark side is still powerful. Never forget that." "I won't," Luke promised. Ben's face softened, and again he smiled. "You will yet face great dangers, Luke," he said, "but you will also find new allies at times and places where you expect them least." "New allies," Luke echoed. "Who are they?" The vision seemed to waver and become fainter. "And now, farewell," Ben said, as if he hadn't heard the question. "I loved you as a son and as a student and as a friend. Until we meet again, may the Force be with you." "Ben!" But Ben turned and the image faded, and in the dream Luke knew he was gone. "Then I am alone," he told himself. "I am the last of the Jedi." He seemed to hear Ben's voice, faint and indistinct, as if from a great distance. "Not the last of the old Jedi, Luke. The first of the new." The voice trailed off into silence and was gone, and Luke woke up. For a moment he just lay there, staring at the dim lights of the Imperial City playing across the ceiling above his bed, and struggling through the sleep-induced disorientation. The disorientation and an immense weight of sadness that seemed to fill the core of his being. First Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru had been murdered. Then Darth Vader, his real father, had sacrificed his own life for Luke's, and now even Ben Kenobi's spirit had been taken away. For the third time, he'd been orphaned. With a sigh, he slid out from under the blankets and pulled on his robe and slippers. His suite contained a small kitchenette, and it took only a few minutes to fix himself a drink, a particularly exotic concoction Lando had introduced him to on his last visit to Coruscant. Then, attaching his lightsaber to his robe sash, he headed up to the roof. He had argued strongly against moving the center of the new republic here to Coruscant, had argued even more strongly against setting up the fledgling government in the old imperial palace. The symbolism was all wrong, for one thing, particularly for a group which, in his opinion, already had a tendency to pay too much attention to symbols. But despite all its drawbacks, he had to admit that the view from the top of the palace was spectacular. For a few minutes he stood at the roof's edge, leaning against the chest high wrought stone railing and letting the cool night breeze ruffle his hair. Even in the middle of the night, the imperial city was a bustle of activity, with the lights of vehicles and streets intertwining to form a sort of flowing work of art. Overhead, lit by both the city lights and those of occasional air speeders flitting through them, the low-lying clouds were a dim sculptured ceiling stretching in all directions, with the same apparent endlessness as the city itself. Far to the south, he could just make out the Minari Mountains, their snow-covered peaks illuminated like the clouds, largely reflected light from the city below. He was gazing at the mountains when, 20 meters behind him, the door into the palace was quietly opened. Automatically, his hand moved towards his lightsaber, but the motion had barely begun before it stopped. The sense of the creature coming through the doorway. "I'm over here, 3PO," he called. He turned to see C-3PO shuffling his way across the roof towards him, radiating the droid's usual mixture of relief and concern. "Hello, Master Luke," he said, tilting his head to look at the cup in Luke's hand. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you." "That's all right," Luke told him. "I just wanted some fresh air, that's all." "Are you certain?" 3PO asked. "Though of course I don't mean to pry." Despite his mood, Luke couldn't help but smile. 3PO's attempts to be simultaneously helpful, inquisitive, and polite never quite came off. Not without looking vaguely comical, anyway. "I'm just a little depressed, I guess," he told the droid, turning back to gaze out over the city again. "Putting together a real functioning government is a lot harder than I expected. Harder than most of the council members expected, too." He hesitated. "Mostly, I guess I'm missing Ben tonight." For a moment, 3PO was silent. "He was always very kind to me," he said at last. "And also to R2, of course." Luke raised his cup to his lips, hiding another smile behind it. "You have a unique perspective on the universe, 3PO," he said. From the corner of his eye, he saw 3PO stiffen. "I hope I didn't offend you, sir," the droid said anxiously. "That was certainly not my intent." "You didn't offend me," Luke assured him. "As a matter of fact, you might have just delivered Ben's last lesson to me." "I beg your pardon?" Luke sipped at his drink. "Governments and entire planets are important, 3PO. But when you sift everything down, they're all just made up of people." There was a brief pause. "Oh," 3PO said. "In other words," Luke amplified, "a Jedi can't get so caught up in matters of galactic importance that it interferes with his concern for individual people." He looked at 3PO and smiled. "Or for individual droids." "Oh, I see, sir." 3PO cocked his head towards Luke's cup. "Forgive me, sir, but may I ask what that is that you're drinking?" "This?" Luke glanced down at his cup. "It's just something that Lando taught me how to make a while back." "Lando?" 3PO echoed, and there was no missing the disapproval in his voice. Program politeness or not, the droid had never really much cared for Lando, which wasn't very surprising given the circumstances of their first meeting. "Yes, but in spite of such a shady origin, it's really quite good," Luke told him. "It's called hot chocolate." "Oh, I see." The droid straightened up. "Well then, sir, If you are indeed all right, I expect I should be on my way. Sure. By the way, what made you come up here in the first place? Princess Leia sent me, of course, 3PO answered, clearly surprised that Luke would have to ask. She said you were in some kind of distress. Luke smiled and shook his head. Leave it to Leia to find a way to cheer him up when he needed it. Show off, he murmured. I beg your pardon, sir. Luke waved a hand. Leia's showing off her new Jedi skills, that's all. Proving that even in the middle of the night she can pick up on my mood. 3PO's head tilted. She really did seem concerned about you, sir. I know, Luke said. I'm just joking. Oh, 3PO seemed to think about that. Shall I tell her you're all right then? Sure, Luke nodded. And while you're down there, tell her that she should quit worrying about me and get herself back to sleep. Those bouts of morning sickness she still gets are bad even enough even when she isn't worn out tired. I'll deliver the message, sir, 3PO said. And, Luke added quietly, tell her I love her. Yes, sir. Good night, Master Luke. Good night, 3PO. He watched the droid go, a fresh flow of depression threatening again to drag him down. 3PO wouldn't understand, of course. No one on the Provisional Council had understood either. But for Leia, just over 3 months pregnant, to be spending the bulk of her time here, he shivered, and not from the cool night air. This place is strong with the dark side. Yoda had said that of the cave on Dagobah, the cave where Luke had gone on to fight a lightsaber duel with a Darth Vader who had turned out to be Luke himself. For weeks afterward, the memory of the sheer power and presence of the dark side had haunted his thoughts. Only much later had he finally realized that Yoda's primary reason for the exercise had been to show him how far he still had to go. Still, he'd often wondered how the cave had come to be the way it had. Wondered whether perhaps someone or something strong in the dark side had once lived there, as the Emperor had once lived here. He shivered again. The really maddening part of it was that he couldn't sense any such concentration of evil in the palace. The council had made a point of asking him about that, in fact, when they'd first considered moving operations here to the Imperial City. He'd had to grit his teeth and tell them that no, there seemed to be no residual effects of the Emperor's stay. But just because he couldn't sense it didn't necessarily mean it wasn't there. He shook his head. Stop it, he ordered himself firmly. Jumping at shadows wasn't going to gain him anything but paranoia. His recent nightmares and poor sleep were probably nothing more than the stresses of watching Leia and the others struggling to turn a military oriented rebellion into a civilian based government. Certainly, Leia would never have agreed to come anywhere near this place if she'd had any doubts herself about it. Leia. With an effort, Luke forced his mind to relax and let his Jedi senses reach outward. Halfway across the palace's upper section, he could feel Leia's drowsy presence. Her presence, and that of the twins she carried within her. For a moment, he held the partial contact, keeping it light enough to hopefully not wake her any further, marveling again at the strange feel of the unborn children within her. The Skywalker heritage was indeed with them. The fact that he could sense them at all implied they must be tremendously strong in the Force. At least, he assumed that was what it meant. It had been something he'd hoped he would someday have a chance to ask Ben about. And now that chance was gone. Fighting back sudden tears, he broke the contact. His mug felt cold against his hand. Swallowing the rest of the chocolate, he took one last look around. At the city, at the clouds, and in his mind's eye at the stars that lay beyond them. Stars, around which revolved planets, upon which lived people. Billions of people. Many of them still waiting for the freedom and light the New Republic had promised them. He closed his eyes against the bright lights and the equally bright hopes. There was, he thought wearily, no magic wand that could make everything better. Not even for a Jedi. 3PO shuffled his way out of the room, and with a tired sigh, Leia Organa Solo settled back against the pillows. Half a victory is better than none, the old saying crossed her mind. The old saying she'd never believed for a minute. Half a victory, to her way of thinking, was also half a defeat. She sighed again, feeling the touch of Luke's mind. His encounter with 3PO had lightened his dark mood, as she'd hoped it would, but with the droid gone, the depression was threatening to overtake him again. Perhaps she should go to him herself, see if she could get him to talk through whatever it was that had been bothering him for the past few weeks. Her stomach twisted, just noticeably. It's all right, she soothed, rubbing her hand gently across her belly. It's all right. I'm just worried about your Uncle Luke, that's all. Slowly, the twisting eased. Picking up the half-filled glass on the nightstand, Leia drank it down, trying not to make a face. Warm milk was pretty far down on her list of favorite drinks, but it had proved to be one of the fastest ways to soothe these periodic twinges from her digestive tract. The doctors had told her that the worst of her stomach troubles should be disappearing any day now. She hoped rather fervently that they were right. Faintly from the next room came the sound of footsteps. Quickly, Leia slapped the glass back on the nightstand with one hand as she hauled the blankets up to her chin with the other. The bedside light was still glowing, and she reached out with the force to try to turn it off. The lamp didn't even flicker. Gritting her teeth, she tried again. Again, it didn't work. Still not enough fine control over the force, obviously, for something as small as a light switch. Untangling herself from the blankets, she tried to make a lunge for it. Across the room, the side door opened to reveal a tall woman in a dressing robe. Your Highness, she called softly, brushing her shimmering white hair back from her eyes. Are you all right? Leia sighed and gave up. Come on in, Winter. How long have you been listening at the door? I haven't been listening, Winter said as she glided into the room, sounding almost offended that Leia would even suggest such a thing of her. I saw the light coming from under your door and thought you might need something. I'm fine, Leia assured her, wondering if this woman would never cease to amaze her. Awakened in the middle of the night, dressed in an old robe with her hair in total disarray, Winter still looked more regal than Leia herself could manage on her best days. She'd lost track of the number of times when, as children together on Alderaan, some visitor to the Viceroy's court had automatically assumed Winter was, in fact, the Princess Leia. Winter had probably not lost track, of course. Anyone who could remember whole conversations verbatim should certainly be able to reconstruct the number of times she'd been mistaken for a royal princess. Leia had often wondered what the rest of the Provisional Council members would think if they knew that the silent assistant sitting beside her at official meetings, or standing beside her at unofficial corridor conversations, was effectively recording every word they said. Some of them, she suspected, wouldn't like it at all. Can I get you some more milk, Your Highness? Winter asked. Or some crackers? No, thank you. Leia shook her head. My stomach isn't really bothering me at the moment. Well, you know. It's Luke. Winter nodded. Same thing that's been bothering him for the past 9 weeks? Leia frowned. Has it been that long? Winter shrugged. You've been busy, she said, with her usual knack for diplomacy. Tell me about it, Leia said dryly. I don't know, Winter. I really don't. He told 3PO that he misses Ben Kenobi, but I can tell that's not all of it. Perhaps it has something to do with your pregnancy, Winter suggested. 9 weeks ago would put it just about right. Yes, I know, Leia agreed. But that's also about the time Mon Mothma and Admiral Akbar were pushing to move the government seat here to Coruscant. Also about the time we started getting those reports from the borderlands about some mysterious tactical genius having taken command of the Imperial fleet. She held her hands out, palms upward. Take your pick. I suppose you'll just have to wait until he's ready to talk to you. Winter considered. Perhaps Captain Solo will be able to draw him out when he returns. Leia squeezed thumb and forefinger together, a wave of anger-filled loneliness sweeping over her. For Han to have gone out on yet another of these stupid contact missions, leaving her all alone. The flash of anger disappeared, dissolving into guilt. Yes, Han was gone again. But even when he was here, it seemed sometimes like they hardly saw each other. With more and more of her time being eaten up by the enormous task of setting up a new government, there were days when she barely had time to eat, let alone see her husband. But that's my job, she reminded herself firmly. And it was a job that unfortunately only she could do. Unlike virtually all the others in the Alliance hierarchy, she had had extensive training in both the theory and the more practical aspects of politics. She'd grown up in the royal house of Alderaan, learning about system wide rule from her foster father, learning it so well that while still in her teens, she was already representing him in the Imperial Senate. Without her expertise, this whole thing could easily collapse, particularly in the critical early stages of the New Republic's development. A few more months, just a few more months, and she'd be able to ease off a little. She'd make it all up to Han then. The guilt faded, but the loneliness remained. Maybe, she told Winter. In the meantime, we'd better both get some sleep. We have a busy day tomorrow. Winter arched her eyebrows slightly. There's another kind? She asked, with a touch of Leia's earlier dryness. Now, Leia admonished mock seriously. You're far too young to become a cynic. I mean it now. Off to bed with you. You're sure you don't need anything first? I'm sure. Go on, scat. All right. Good night, Your Highness. She glided out, closing the door behind her. Sliding down flat onto the bed, Leia readjusted the blankets over her and shifted the pillows into a more or less comfortable position. Good night to you two, too, she said softly to her babies, giving her belly another gentle rub. Han had suggested more than once that anyone who talked to her own stomach was slightly nuts. But then, she suspected that Han secretly believed everyone was slightly nuts. She missed him terribly. With a sigh, she reached over to the nightstand and turned off the light. Eventually, she fell asleep. A quarter of the way across the galaxy, Han Solo sipped at his mug and surveyed the semi organized chaos flowing all around him. Didn't we, he quoted to himself, just leave this party? Still, it was nice to know that in a galaxy busily turning itself upside down, there were some things that never changed. The band playing off in the corner was different, and the upholstery in the booth was noticeably less comfortable. But apart from that, the Mos Eisley Cantina looked exactly the same as it always had, the same as it had looked the day he'd first met Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. It felt like a dozen lifetimes ago. Beside him, Chewbacca growled softly. Don't worry, he'll be here, Han told him. It's just Dravis. I don't think he's ever been on time for anything in his whole life. Slowly, he let his eyes drift over the crowd. No, he amended to himself, there was one other thing different about the cantina. Virtually none of the other smugglers who had once frequented the place were anywhere to be seen. Whoever had taken over what was left of Jabba the Hutt's organization must have moved operations off Tatooine. Turning to peer towards the cantina's back door, he made a mental note to ask Dravis about it. He was still gazing off to the side when a shadow fell across the table. Hello, Solo, a snickering voice said. Han gave himself a 3 count before turning casually to face the voice. Well, hello, Dravis. He nodded. Long time no see. Have a seat. Sure, Dravis said with a grin. Soon as you and Chewie both put your hands on the table. Han gave him an injured look. Oh, come on, he said, reaching up to cradle his mug with both hands. You think I'd invite you all the way out here just to shoot you? We're old buddies, remember? Sure we are, Dravis said, throwing Chewbacca an appraising glance as he sat down. Or at least we used to be. But I hear you've gone respectable. Han shrugged eloquently. Respectable's such a vague word. Dravis cocked an eyebrow. Oh, well then, let's be specific, he said sardonically. I hear you joined the Rebel Alliance, got made a general, married a former Alderanian princess, and got yourself a set of twins on the way. Han waved a self-deprecating hand. Actually, I resigned the general part a few months back. Dravis snorted. Forgive me. So what's all this about? Some kind of warning? Han frowned. What do you mean? Don't play the innocent, Solo, Dravis said, the banter gone from his tone. New Republic replaces Empire. All fine and sweet and dandy. But you know as well as I do that it's all the same to smugglers. So if this is an official invitation to cease and desist our business activities, let me laugh in your face and get out of here. He started to get up. It's nothing like that, Han told him. As a matter of fact, I was hoping to hire you. Dravis froze, halfway up. What? He asked warily. You heard right, Han said. We're looking to hire smugglers. Slowly, Dravis sat back down. Is this something to do with your fight with the Empire? He demanded. Because if it is, it isn't, Han assured him. There's a whole spiel that goes along with this, but what it boils down to is that the New Republic is short of cargo ships at the moment, not to mention experienced cargo ship pilots. If you're looking to earn some quick and honest money, this would be a good time to do it. Aha. Dravis leaned back in his chair, draping an arm over the seat back as he eyed Han suspiciously. So what's the catch? Han shook his head. No catch. We need ships and pilots to get interstellar trade going again. You got 'em. That's all there is to it. Dravis seemed to think it over. So why work for you and your pittance directly? He demanded. Why can't we just smuggle the stuff and make more per trip? You could do that, Han conceded, but only if your customers had to pay the kind of tariffs that would make hiring smugglers worthwhile. In this case, he smiled, they won't. Dravis glared at him. Oh, come on, Solo. A brand new government, hard pressed like crazy for cash, and you want me to believe they won't be piling tariffs on top of each other? Believe anything you want, Han said, letting his own tone go frosty. Go ahead and try it, too. But when you're convinced, give me a call. Dravis chewed at the inside of his cheek, his eyes never leaving Han's. You know, Solo, he said thoughtfully, I wouldn't have come if I didn't trust you. Well, maybe I was curious, too, to see what scam you were pulling. And I might be willing to believe you on this, at least enough to check it out myself. But I'll tell you right up front that a lot of others in my group won't. Why not? Because you've gone respectable, that's why. Ah, don't give me that hurt look. The simple fact is that you've been out of the business too long to even remember what it's like. Profits are what drive a smuggler, Solo. Profits and excitement. So what are you going to do instead? Operate in the Imperial sectors? Han countered, trying hard to remember all those lessons in diplomacy that Leia had given him. Ravis shrugged. It pays, he said simply. For now, maybe, Han reminded him. But their territory's been shrinking for 5 years straight, and it's going to keep getting smaller. We're just about evenly gunned now, you know, and our people are more motivated and a lot better trained than theirs. Maybe. Dravis cocked an eyebrow. But maybe not. I hear rumors that there's someone new in charge out there. Someone who's been giving you a lot of trouble. Like in the Abroa Sky system, for instance. I hear you lost an Alaman task force out there just a little while ago. Awfully sloppy losing a whole task force like that. Han gritted his teeth. Just remember that anybody who gives us trouble is going to give you trouble too. He leveled a finger at the other. And if you think the New Republic is hungry for cash, think of how hungry the Empire must be right now. It's certainly an adventure, Dravis agreed easily, getting to his feet. Well, it really was nice seeing you again, Solo, but I gotta go. Say hi to your princess for me. Han sighed. Just give your people our offer, okay? Oh, I will. Might even be some who will take you up on it. You never can tell. Han nodded. It was, really, all he could have expected out of this meeting. One other thing, Dravis. Who exactly is the big fish in the pond now that Jabba's gone? Dravis eyed him thoughtfully. Well, I guess it's not really a secret, he decided. Mind you, there aren't any really official numbers, but if I were betting, I'd put my money on Talon Card. Han frowned. He'd heard of Card, of course, but never with any hint that his organization was even in the top 10, let alone the one on top. Either Dravis was wrong, or Card was the type who believed in keeping a low profile. Where can I find him? Dravis smiled slyly. You'd like to know that, wouldn't you? Maybe someday I'll tell you, Dravis, gotta go. See you around, Chewie. He started the turn, paused. Oh, by the way, you might tell your pal over there that he's got to be the worst excuse for a backup man that I've ever seen. Just thought you'd like to know. With another grin, he turned again and headed back into the crowd. Han grimaced as he watched him go. Still, at least Dravis had been willing to turn his back on them as he left. Some of the other smugglers he'd contacted hadn't even trusted him that far. Progress. Sort of. Beside him, Chewbacca growled something derogatory. Well, what do you expect with Admiral Akbar sitting on the council? Han shrugged. The Calamarians were death on smugglers even before the war, and everyone knows it. Don't worry. They'll come around. Some of them, anyway. Dravis can blather all he wants about profit and excitement, but you offer them secure maintenance facilities, no Jabba-style skimming, and no one shooting at them, and they'll get interested. Come on, let's get going. He slid out of the booth and headed for the cantina and the exit just visible beyond it. Halfway across, he stopped at one of the other booths and looked down at its lone occupant. I got a message for you, he announced. I'm supposed to tell you that you're the worst excuse for a backup man that Dravis has ever seen. Wedge Antilles grinned up at him as he slid out from behind the table. I thought that was the whole idea, he said, running his fingers through his black hair. Yes, but Dravis didn't. Though privately, Han would be the first to admit that Dravis had a point. As far as he was concerned, the only time Wedge didn't stick out like a lump on a plate glass was when he was sitting in the cockpit of an X-Wing, blasting TIE fighters into dust. So where's Paige, anyway? He asked, glancing around. Right here, sir, a quiet voice said at his shoulder. Han turned. Beside them it appeared a medium height, medium build, totally nondescript looking man. The kind of man no one would really notice. The kind who could blend invisibly into almost any surroundings. Which had again been the whole idea. You see anything suspicious? Han asked him. Page shook his head. No backup troops, no weapons other than his blaster. This guy must have genuinely trusted you. Yeah, progress. Han took one last look around. Let's get going. We're going to be late enough back to Coruscant as it is, and I want to swing through the Obroa sky system on the way. That missing Alaman task force? Wedge asked. Yeah, Han said grimly. I want to see if they've figured out what happened to it yet, and if we're lucky, maybe get some idea of who did it to them. And that's the end of chapter 2. Something that's kind of interesting, I think, about this Thrawn novel is it's the one that really kickstarted the revival of Star Wars in the 90s. And you can see, even in these first 2 chapters, that they address some of the concerns that should have been on the minds of the people that made both the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy. Um, Especially as concerns the formation of a galactic government. They are addressing the fact that they're moving from a rebellion that was conducting a revolution to something that's supposed to approximate a functioning government. And that's not an easy process. That's something that's being addressed rather poorly right now, I feel, in The Mandalorian. They're showing the New Republic to be completely incompetent. Some of that can be explained by the fact that the empire was vast and the rebellion's resources were low, and they're now trying to take control of what had gone before. But I think that this has a more realistic take, especially later in the story, as you'll see that there are squabbling faction members of the rebellion who have different ideas about how the government should run. It's gone from being a rebellion for survival of individual liberty, and it's instead become a political arena where people are vying for position, and that becomes interesting as an important plot point. Something else that I think was important, especially in this chapter, is that they're establishing that Force ghosts can't hang around forever. Traditionally, in mythological stories, ghosts hang around for one or two reasons. One is because they have unfinished business or some type of vengeance that they need to enact. But in deeper stories, they usually act as messengers. They're imparting an important message, usually with some kind of limited forecast of the future to the protagonist of the story. And oftentimes that communication is only one way. One thing that I think is interesting about Ben Kenobi in particular as a Force ghost is that you can see that style of portrayal of Ben as a ghost in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke has been attacked by the Wampa and he is lying on the ice and snow and calling out for Ben's help, and Ben appears to him and tells him that he will go to the Dagobah system, but he doesn't really react to anything that Luke says. It's somewhat implied that either Ben cannot hear him or he's not going to respond directly to him. That changed in Return of the Jedi. And so I think that that portrayal was somewhat inconsistent. Ben did somewhat respond in The Empire Strikes Back in Yoda's hut when they were discussing whether or not Yoda would train Luke. But even then, Ben didn't so much directly address Luke as he did Yoda. Um, I do think it's important that there's a time limit on Force Ghost's ability to manifest into the material plane, primarily because the Jedi are only able to retain their identity through acceptance of death. If you continue to appear there in the physical plane, you're not really accepting it. You're still acting on that mortal plane. That's something that the Sith seek to have. And so I think it's important that you don't overuse Force Ghosts. That's something that I think they made a real mistake with in the sequel trilogy. Although they also kind of tried to make Force Ghosts different in order to appease China. So I don't think they really had any kind of grasp on what they were doing there. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that chapter. Let me know what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed this. I apologize for having to clear my throat a few times. Like I said, it's somewhat difficult to talk this much without drinking a little bit of water along the way. Hope you guys all enjoy your weekend. I'll be talking to you all real soon.